I want to introduce now our two panelists for the evening. First, Premal Dharia is the founder and director of the Defender Impact Initiative. She spent nearly 15 years as a public defender, before turning her attention to challenge the system of mass criminalization more broadly. Her organization, the Defender Impact Initiative, she works with public defenders. They work with organizers and other advocates towards structural change, and they focus on advancing the role of public defenders and people they represent in the movement against mass incarceration. So it's great to have her join us tonight, and I thank you so much, Premal. We're also joined by Jim Wyda, who is the federal public defender for the District of Maryland since 1998. Jim is a local. He grew up in East Baltimore. He graduated from Loyola Lakefield, just about 100 yards from where I'm sitting. He went to Trinity College and Yale Law School, and he clerked for the Honorable Frank Kaufman, U.S. District Judge. And he's also an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland Law School. And I should also mention that, full disclosure, Jim is a friend of mine. We belong to the same book club. And in fact, Jim is somewhat responsible for this organization. It was about 5 years ago. It was he who told all of us in the book club that mentioned that this rock star lawyer by the name of Brian Stevenson was coming to town to speak at the Pratt Library. And that's honestly how this whole thing started, was when I went to see him. So I thank Jim for that. So in preparing for this thing tonight, I wanted to go back and see if there was any kind of, what kind of update there might be since the time the film came out. And it's a fairly recent film, so not a lot has changed. But one thing I did discover is that last summer, the DOJ, Department of Justice here, they released a report, data, and they found that, not surprisingly, this country still incarcerates our citizens at a rate that is 5 to 10 times higher than any other industrialized country. As of 2017, there were nearly 2.3 million people incarcerated in jails, prisons across the country. That's a 500% increase over the last 40 years. The Sentencing Project noted that there has been a modest decline recently, about 7.3% since 2009, but most of that decline is actually attributable to 6 states who have actually reduced their prison populations by 30%. But even so, and by the way, Maryland is, we have reduced we peaked in 2007, and since then, the prison population here is down 15.6%. But nonetheless, at the current rate of decline, it will take 75 years to cut the prison population by half. So that's kind of a grim way to start the evening. So I wanted to actually begin by asking Jim and Premal first. You guys are in the business, and I'm just wondering what the biggest takeaway was for you from this movie.
Sure, and I just want to start by saying thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate the work that you're doing and the ability to be here and to speak to everyone who's present. So thank you for this opportunity. There's no question that this film is so powerful. For me, a couple of the reasons that it's so powerful and so stands out among the sort of national media, that's focused on mass incarceration, is first that it draws this very clear trajectory from the time of slavery to where we are now, and really builds that narrative very beautifully and very clearly. And so I think that that's a really important piece. And second, that the film does a great job, I think, of emphasizing and clarifying how structural the problems are. And I think that that's important partly because, in conversations about mass incarceration, it's easy to get drawn into individual stories and individual cases. And while that can be really important, it's really critical to remember to take a step back and acknowledge that these are systemic issues, that we're here today because of choices that were made and policy decisions that were made, and the problems are systemic. And in order to address them, we're going to have to make systemic changes, and not just sort of chip away, in little pieces. And so for me, that was a huge takeaway, and I thought a really important contribution to the national conversation.
So I want to ask Jim the same question, but before I do, I did want to ask you, given the the way prisons are regulated and run and the legal systems, how do you make systemic changes when you have a criminal justice system that is so fractured?
That's a great question. It's the central question, right? And I don't think there's an easy answer. I think that the problems are so deeply entrenched in decades or even centuries of structural racism, and so many other or sort of entrenched problems in our country, and the results of so many political choices that have calcified over the years. And so I think the answer in short is that we're going to have to ask ourselves really big questions, and not just questions about sort of individual policies or individual cases, but really, what are we doing? What does it mean to cause harm? And how do we want to, as a community, address harm? What does it mean to punish people? And are we doing that? Is that something we want to be doing? What is our system actually doing to people? And what is public safety? And how do we address that? And so I think that, the film does a great job of contributing to those answers. And I think that we need to have more and more conversations that help us get to some of those big answers that will help us tackle the changes that need to be made.
I think another thing the film does also is that it engages, those are hard topics and hard questions to even engage. And I thought the way it was very captivating and engaging and compelling. Jim, what about you? What was the biggest takeaway that for you from this film?
So first of all, again, thanks for having us, Will, and thanks for all the good work that you and the project do. And Premal and I are both grateful to be here tonight. And second of all, I'm not a movie critic. I'm not going to be able to give a great deal of insight into this film. Frankly, I'm more of a reader than a movie watcher. And when I do watch movies, I probably don't watch movies that are sort of about my work and my professional life. But I have to admit, sort of, I found this to be a very powerful, and compelling case for how broken the criminal justice system is. As Premal pointed out, again, she makes the connections between slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and really, I think, George Floyd, kind of where we are today in terms of sort of just the punitive and violent nature of our criminal justice system. One of the things that, again, I think is the benefit of, for me at least, of looking at a movie about these topics is that she was able to use images and film clips to show how really a mindlessly punitive system can operate, the way it dehumanizes people and demonizes people in order to function. The tool for mass incarceration is to say that there's another out there, that they're not like us. And we saw that in the film through the film clips from Birth of a Nation up to Hillary Clinton talking about our children being super predators. And I see that in my work still. I appear in front of judges and litigate against prosecutors all the time who tell themselves that they're protecting the community, and that my clients aren't worthy of empathy or of redemption. And the reason why they can do that is because they don't see the humanity and the decency in the people that are getting tangled up in the system. And again, I thought the movie did a fabulous job of outlining that. The final point, I guess, that I wanted to make, and I have to admit I sort of have mixed feelings about it. And again, it's about the way the movie ended. It's about that stream of images of the awful shootings of Black men, the assaults on Black men that occurred, to close the movie. There's a part of me that is sort of made deeply uncomfortable about sort of using those images in a way. I can't imagine having a loved one be on the evening, loss of a loved one, having that tragedy be on the evening news or even in this movie. On the other hand, as I try to think through what's accounted for why there were so many people out in the streets this year, why there feels like there's so much momentum finally to bring real change to this important issue, I can't help but think it's the power of images versus words, and that it's the power of cell phone cameras capturing the horror that has been going on in our criminal justice system and really in our country for hundreds of years now.
I agree with you about the way I thought it was very powerful, but I also note that they took pains to point out that the footage was used with permission of the family. And also I thought it was interesting that they kind of followed up under the credits. They used these wonderful images of Black families and kids and people, and were generally joyful. But it brings up a question also about the role of the media in perpetuating this. I worked in a newsroom for a number of years, and there were two basic tools that you used in the newsroom. One was the newspaper, because TV news gets most of its news from the newspaper, and the other is a police scanner. I mean, that was on 24/7, and so much of the day was spent chasing crime or fire. So I'm wondering, how much of a role do you think the media does play in perpetuating and in aggravating this system? Yes, I'm asking you, Jim.
I will go first this time, since Premal went first last time, but I'm actually looking forward to Premal's answer regarding this, because I think she's probably thought about it more deeply. But there's no doubt that the media portrayal of, again, sort of borrowing Hillary Clinton's line from the movie, of super predators and sort of demonizing and frankly exaggerating the threat, and not having the time or the patience or the will to tell the rest of the story. Again, I'll do this real quickly and then turn it over to Premal. Again, one of the things I see in my work all the time is the system telling itself that it's protecting the public by putting people in jail for long periods of time. And again, after watching that movie, after looking at the stats that anybody can look at every day about whether they feel safer in this community, whether we've made any difference in the availability of drugs or the prevalence of drugs as we fight a war on drugs, no one can feel good about how we're doing safeguarding the community. And what I've come to believe is that myth that prosecutors and judges and the system is telling itself is preventing us from looking at the deeper reasons that underlie crime. That unless you're going to invest in my clients' lives and their victims' lives, unless we're going to invest in the neighborhoods where my clients grow up, we're not going to make any impact on, quote, the crime problem in our community. And the media's unwillingness to sort of take anything but the easy story that is usually sort of a racial story that feeds into the tropes that this film was addressing, it's going to be very, very difficult to make progress.
Premal, do you have any other thoughts on the role of the media in this, perpetuating this system?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Jim said. And I think that the film did a great job of laying out specific examples from the past, the Willie Horton example and others that have really produced fear, intentionally produced fear, right? And used for political purposes and to cultivate certain political will among our communities, so that our mass incarceration system could be built the way that it is now. And so I think that was a really helpful thing, I think, for me and for a lot of other people to see done so well in the film. I think that, in terms of, there's been an increasing use of media, social media, and tactics like that to address the problems that we're increasingly, seeing through, as Jim said, through video and cell phone footage and things like that, body camera footage. And I think that there can be real utility to a lot of that. And certainly with respect to, cases where families have given permission or want the footage to be used, for advocacy purposes, or where there are coordinated defense campaigns on behalf of individuals who are incarcerated, or that sort of situation. There's no denying that it's very powerful. I also, would caution that I think it can be really dangerous, both because, as you mentioned, Will, it can reinforce stereotypes or tropes that are harmful, and because they can sometimes reinforce the very logic that underlies our system, right? The logics of criminality and of punishment, and of policing, that are actually at their core harmful. And so my organization actually put out this sort of toolkit for social media use, for people who are advocating on social media against our system of mass incarceration and criminalization, to be mindful of some of these things in particular, to be mindful of respecting privacy and dignity, and of not reinforcing traumatic experiences for audiences, and for not reinforcing harmful stereotypes.
Yeah. So I would just reinforce what you were saying also about the role of the media, because it also has been responsible for some pivotal changes, positive changes. I mean, we talked about, well, what's going on now, but with the John Lewis his recent passing, we've seen a lot of that footage from the 60s, which certainly did a lot to motivate public opinion. And Emmett Till, Emmett Till's mother, that is beyond description. I understand we have a question. Carol, are you around? Do you have a question?
We've got a lot of great questions coming in. So let me start with the first one that came through. Let's see, I actually have to scroll up a second because they're coming in fast and furious. Okay, so this is in the context of current day scenarios. And the person asked, if the pandemic is a portal, as Arundhati Roy has written, what might be possible in this unique and challenging moment? So how can we find some positivity, or how can this propel us into new possibilities at this current challenging time that's kind of brought us together as a society?
Would either of you care to take that on?
I feel like every one of these, I'm in the game of chicken with Premal. Again, Premal, I'm happy to go, or I don't want to sort of cut you off.
Go for it.
So again, I'm not sure I'm going to do a great job on this, but I joked with Premal earlier today about this concept of hope, and whether how we felt about how it would play out. Certainly, public defenders deal with a lot of frustration, and it feels our clients have been let down by the system, by the community, by life, so much that I think it leads to, potentially a lack of optimism on our part. But I also feel obligated to be optimistic, and I do think there is cause for optimism in these times. Again, I'll focus maybe. I'll try to address the pandemic, but I'll certainly address sort of the response to George Floyd's death. Again, it feels like that there is an energy out there that's broad-based, that's diverse, that has more folks sort of expressing support, that provides an opportunity for significant change. We'll ask Premal a very tough question about sort of how to accomplish that systemic change. And that path is going to be hard. But I do think there is an opportunity here. And some of it's based upon really what this project, I think, is founded upon, which is that we have to reckon with our past. We have to understand kind of where we are and where we came from before we can move forward. And again, what I think, with the Freddie Gray incident and with all of these incidents that have, all of these tragedies that have brought so many people out into the street, it feels impossible to deny that our system is broken and that this isn't the product of a few bad apples. But in order to change this, it's going to take broad systemic change, the way Premal sort of outlined. And again, I'm not so sure how I can, it may be taxing my ability to be optimistic about the pandemic, other than it seems to reflect all the flaws in our society, the way it is impacting upon, sort of the most vulnerable in our community, in our public health world, as in our criminal justice world. The folks who can least afford to suffer all the time. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with Jim. About hope and the rest of it. I would just say that I think the pandemic, in particular, I mean, has been utterly devastating, and particularly for those caught in the web of the criminal system. There's no question that it's been a question of life and death, and has put people in completely unimaginable situations that they should never have been in or be in. With that said, I think it has presented a tremendous opportunity to rethink a lot of what we're doing, and I'm somewhat discouraged by that there hasn't been more radical response, because I do think it has presented precisely the kinds of questions that I was getting at earlier. What is public safety if it's literally a threat to life to be incarcerated? What are we talking about? Who's making that decision about what the scale is of safety and for whom? And why do we have police making so many custodial arrests when it turns out you can cite and release lots of people for the same things that they're currently booking people into police stations for? So these are the kinds of changes that have come about as a result of the pandemic in some places. It's led to some reduced incarceration in some places. And I think that there's a lot that remains to be seen about opportunities that could be taken, and what the results will be, but a lot more could be done. And I think it's the result of this opening that it's given us, even though it's been so devastating.
One of the things that actually surprised me when I was just looking back at this was that how few of the massive number of arrests that we have in this country are actually for serious violent offenses. I think 5%. And yet we have, 5 million unique individuals arrested and jailed every year. So how does that happen? I mean, this is an example, I think, of what Jim was talking about earlier about how the the system is kind of skewed against poor people. It's the criminalization of poverty. Jim, how do you see that play out every day with your clients? I mean, I know it's something you have to manage.
So again, I think, again, Pamela and I have a complementary set of experiences here. And so again, I will go first here. But so, I mean, again, one way that just poverty and race play out in my job, and again, probably maybe many folks don't understand sort of the federal versus the state system and sort of how it works. But I'm in the Federal Public Defender's Office, which represents poor people charged with crimes in federal court. I think traditionally, years ago, when I clerked in the federal courthouse, being in federal court meant maybe that it was some sort of sophisticated case, whether it be a civil matter or a criminal matter. It was some sort of crossing state lines case or government corruption case or some sophisticated white collar case. Instead, what's happening really is a product of after the 80s, of sort of the war on drugs and sort of the Reagan years, is that street crime has been brought to the federal court in just huge numbers. But what happens in Maryland is that those cases are primarily young, poor, African-American, primarily doesn't capture it. Overwhelmingly young, poor, African-American men from Baltimore City and PG County. We're statewide, but we primarily, the U.S. Attorney's Office primarily serves to prosecute in cases out of Baltimore City and PG County. And the other thing to know about being in the federal system is it has the most brutal sentencing system. So when you select that population, this overwhelmingly poor, primarily African-American population, you're bringing them into a system that is going to chew them up, that is going to ruin their lives forever, that they're going to face unbelievable sanctions solely because they were selected. And there's some report somewhere that says we did 100 gun cases out of Baltimore City, or we did 200 drug cases out of Baltimore City. And it becomes a numbers game instead of, the sort of the individual stories in each case. I'll give one example real quick from a case that just was in my office this week. I was watching a young attorney handling it. But so again, it sort of was mentioned in the movie, the way sort of the problems that come with mandatory minimums. So the client was, I think is probably in his early 40s, had served in the military, had worked, had a family, and had built a pretty decent life. And then he became addicted to pain medications. And in order to support himself, he started doing really what we call street level dealing. He started buying enough for himself and then selling the rest to sort of support himself, to pay for the habit. Unfortunately, he ran into a federal informant, and the federal informant, brought him to the federal agents, and they watched him do a series of transactions. They could have arrested him after the first, but by doing 3 transactions, they triggered a 10-year mandatory minimum. The federal prosecutors are given the authority to file what we call an 851, which if you can double the mandatory minimum within the discretion of the prosecutor. And so by that case being brought here, solely by that decision, this guy was just in dire, dire trouble for a man that primarily had a substance abuse problem, had almost no criminal record, had the ability and the capacity to work, had people who loved him and who really needed treatment. And so our criminal justice system, again, I think this was in Premal's sort of solution section from a few minutes ago, is it just needs to change the way it looks at what it's doing. Nobody benefits from putting that client in prison for 10 years, 20 years. Everyone will be better off. The system will be better off if he's home as quickly as possible, in treatment, supporting the people who love him and who he loves. And again, other than sort of just the machinery rolling over people the way it does, there's no reason to justify that outcome.
Is there any incentive for prosecutors to exercise mercy?
So, I mean, I'm not going to say any, there's good prosecutors out there, and again, the world probably needs more good prosecutors, but it is sort of challenging for prosecutor offices try to treat everybody the same way. Again, part of the contrast, like Premal and I, serving as public defenders, view each of our clients as they each have a story. We remember just about all of them. Again, for me, maybe not the names, but I remember an awful lot of stories. Prosecutors, really believe that they have to do equal, in their mind, equal justice for all, so equal sanctions for all, and it's very hard for them to nuance. And again, at times in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland, because it was coming from the Department of Justice, there were policies that said you can't, once you bring a case, you can't negotiate away a mandatory minimum. You have to give that mandatory minimum because that's our policy. We're going to treat everybody the same way, no matter who their lawyer is, no matter what their story is. We're going to treat them the same harsh, mindless way.
So why, and Premal, maybe you have some insight on this, why is it so much worse in Maryland than it is elsewhere? I mean, we have the worst disparity of in our prison population between Black and white prisoners, the worst in the country. 72% of the prison population in Maryland is Black. 30% of the state population is Black. How does that happen? And it's just confusing me because Maryland's such a blue state.
Yeah, I think, well, the last point that you made, and I think, to be clear, I think Jim's a much better expert on Maryland than I am, but I can give you some more general answers that I think go to your question. And one is about the last point you made about it being a blue state. And I think in recent years, there have certainly been trends where Democrats or liberals are sort of more interested in change to the criminal system and ending mass incarceration. But I think that there's also a lot of danger in some of the sort of easy, accessible reforms that are often, put out as the ones that liberals should follow or Democrats should follow. And so I just want to caution that I think that, sometimes it's dangerous to sort of just go along with what those what certain parties or liberals might say. A lot of liberal reforms, and I think we're seeing this now play out in the debate around policing, and what will really make the kind of meaningful, transformative change that we need to end the structural problems, right? And so I think we should be careful when we're thinking about reforms about what are we replacing what we currently have with, and one example of that is that a lot of the ending incarceration reforms result in massive surveillance, right? And so we have millions of largely Black Americans who are under state surveillance, even though they're not incarcerated. And so, and in many cases, those are liberal reforms because it was a way to end, to decarcerate. And so we want to be careful and thoughtful about some of those things, and I think that that generally speaking, the history of structural racism in our country is such that some of the fixes that we've gone after are not going to get at the underlying problem, which is one of the reasons I'm so inspired by and impressed by the work that you all are doing, because I think it's so important to tell these larger narrative stories and to really trace history, because that's how we got where we are. That's how we got to these numbers, right? Like it's not about one person. It's not about, a few cases. Those are important. But ultimately there's an arc there that needs to be followed. And I think raising public consciousness, telling these stories more, which is, of course, why I think this film is so important. And there should be more stories like this. And we should have some of the hard conversations, like the one that Jim was just having about what federal court really looks like, and what it really means for someone to have the experience of being charged in federal court. And when we talk about incarceration, some of the other hard conversations are talking about people who've committed acts of violence, right? Which is actually a very small portion of who gets arrested, but a very large portion of who's incarcerated in our prisons. I think nearly 1 million people of the 2.3 number are incarcerated for so-called violent offenses. It's almost 40% of jails and prisons combined. I mean, it's a huge, staggering number. And that's because we've given such long sentences to people accused of certain crimes. And so we need to have some of those hard conversations. We also need to have conversations about the reality of what you were describing earlier, the criminalization of poverty. There are hundreds of thousands of people that are incarcerated because they're poor. In many places, including in Maryland, people are incarcerated or otherwise penalized for not being able to pay fines and fees. There are fees attached often to the privilege of being prosecuted or incarcerated, or wearing an ankle monitor. These, and then when you can't pay, you might lose your driver's license. You might be jailed. You might have your probation extended indefinitely. So these are directly related to poverty in many cases. And there are also other conversations that we need to be having about who's in our jails and prisons that are less accessible, frankly, but that are really important conversations to have. People who are held on detainers. And I know, so for example, the Kalief Browder story is one that most people have heard, and that is highlighted in the film. And I think it's a really important story to tell for the obvious devastating reasons. It highlights in so many ways, like the tragic loss of his life highlights how deeply incarceration ruins lives and tears families apart, and triggers mental health issues and all kinds of things. But an important facet of Kalief Browder's story is that in addition to being unable to pay the bail that was initially set in his case, he was held on a probation detainer, right? And so there's all these sort of things that are not necessarily accessible or known about in the broad discourse, but that really need to be talked about more. Probation detainers and parole detainers and immigration detainers are a huge source of what keeps people locked up. 1/3 of some jail populations around the country are people on detainers, those kinds of detainers. So just an example of some of the reasons that might not be obvious at first glance, but that are really, driving this bloated jail and prison situation that we find ourselves in.
Can you just briefly describe what a detainer is?
Sure, of course. So if you're on probation, for example, and you get arrested, which is what happened to Kalief Browder, you get arrested for whatever, something new, even if it's something silly, because you're on probation. So what's called a detainer might lodge that allows you to stay incarcerated if if the probation department, depending on where you are, or the judge says, well, I might have released you in this new case, but because you're on probation, you're going to stay locked up until everything gets resolved, or until you finish, a violation of your probation sentence. And that can also be true if you're on parole or supervised release. It can be true if you have some other hold, like an immigration agency has decided that you need to face an immigration court, and so you can be detained even though you would otherwise be released in your pending criminal case.
Thank you.
Well,
Carol? Oh, go ahead, Jim.
I don't want to go on long, but just sort of, and again, sort of one of the things that impacts those things, it takes a really good lawyer to unpack all of that stuff, sort of to figure out the levers to hit to get a client out who's got maybe detainers for small things in 2 different places. And again, sort of underfunded public defenders' offices sometimes can't reach those folks. And again, I think it's probably unintended consequences a lot of time, but it's something, again, that Premal and I and others in the system, I think, see all the time, that where people can just fall through the cracks. And again, it just does. And being detained, even for short periods of time, the damage that does to people. Again, if you're working, whatever the job may be, but you're working and you're able to pay your rent, and then you get incarcerated for 2 months. and maybe you're not making much money, but you're making a go of it. You end up losing your apartment, losing your things, perhaps losing your car. When you finally get released, you're set on a completely different path than you were before that arrest, maybe before that detainer kicked in, and that there wasn't a lawyer around to help you figure out how to get rid of it.
Thank you. Carol, you have another one. I also just want to mention real quickly, Carol Brooks, who's providing our questions tonight, is the leader of the Baltimore County Coalition and is doing a spectacular job.
Thanks, Carol.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of questions. I'm going to ask, I'm hoping that as the listeners are hearing what the speakers are saying, you've been answering so many of the questions that are coming in. So I'm trying to group them so that we can continue the conversation. So hopefully I get your questions in so that they can be addressed appropriately. So in the line of the criminal justice system, there's a lot of questions about reform, as well as practices of restorative justice. And so I'm kind of compiling a couple of questions, but folks are wondering what your feelings are, first of all, about the whole system of privatization of prisons, and the profitability that's in that. Are there ways that we can de-incentivize the profitability? Can that be changed? And also with decriminalization of like certain drug offenses and minor offenses, are there ways to change the system of punishment, or actually change it to a system of restoration, rehabilitation, and restorative justice? How do we rebuild these people's lives, and how do we change the narrative around why people have been incarcerated? How do we change their trajectory to advocate that they are no longer imprisoned? But then how do you change the justice reform system for those people who are incarcerated? So I hope that, I know that was a lot, but that's what's coming in from the chat room.
Emma, why don't you grab something and I'll do whatever's left remaining there.
Okay. I'm not going to be able to answer all of that, but I will take a piece. And I guess I'll start with how to approach change in a way that gets at some of the big questions, which is what I think is underlying some of those. If we truly want to seek, restorative justice or restoration, accountability, or sort of harm reduction, if we want to seek those things, which I think are some of the values that people might believe to be at the center of our criminal system, but actually aren't. But that those are the things that people want in communities, that we need to recognize, first of all, that ultimately communities themselves are going to have to be responsible for those things. And so we need to support and resource communities to be able to have those structures to provide for each other. And we're seeing a lot of that come up now in the context of the pandemic, not so much in the criminal system, but in the context of the pandemic, mutual aid. I mean, there's been so much amazing community showing of support for each other. And I think that same ethos can translate and transfer, and has historically, to addressing harm. And so sort of the other side of that that's important is for people who are thinking about change and reform. Certainly there are policies that can and should be changed. Certainly there are ways to, address bad behavior by police or address harmful sentencing policies and structures. I think ultimately a guiding principle for people who really want to make transformative change is to think about shrinking the system, right? Because the system itself is not going to be the source of the change that we really want to see if those are the things we want. There's no universe in which law enforcement, including prosecution, is going to be the answer to providing restoration to people who have suffered harm. And that includes people who are charged in the system, and also who are victimized by people who are charged in the system. Right. So a guiding principle and sort of thing to come back to regularly is to think about how do we shrink the reach of prosecution? How do we shrink the reach of police? How do we minimize their presence in our lives and turn to communities and to each other instead to address the harm that's in our neighborhoods and in our homes? So that's one answer that I think gets at a bunch of the questions that were in there.
In light of the many questions, I thought Premal did a great job with that, and I don't think I'm going to add anything to that. So,
Jim, can I ask you, since we're on this, I wanted to ask you about the consent decree with the Baltimore police. There's a big menu about community oversight and community policing and reform policies and so on and so forth. But my question is, well, first of all, what is the status of that? Has it had any impact? And what about the problem that it's the same cops as, as the reason for needing the decree?
So the consent decree sort of litigation and monitoring, et cetera, is ongoing. It's I would say this about it. Again, there's the judge presiding over it is someone I know well. I appear in front of. He's the former federal defender, and I think he very much wants to bring good change to the Baltimore City Police Department. What I think that means for him is improving, making it a better traditional police department, and there will certainly be carryovers, et cetera, from the prior police department. But again, if I can sort of articulate what I think is just wrong with the Baltimore City Police Department, again, I believe there are individual police officers there that are good at what they do, devoted public servants, but systemically it's deeply flawed, and it's going to take the Department of Justice in its report that led to the consent decree found that as a constitutional matter it was systemically flawed and broken, and so it needs to get sort of the trust of the community. To do that, it needs to be seen. It needs to be held accountable by the community. Kind of going back to Premal's theme, is it really has to see itself and be seen by the community as working for the community and serving the community. Until it gets there, the problem, one of the many problems in the Baltimore City justice system right now, one of the reasons why there's so many cases being brought over to federal court, is because there is sort of no trust between the Baltimore City police and the community. They have difficulty getting convictions, and in that way, again, I don't blame the community for that. The jurors all have no record by definition, but they've lost faith in sort of the work of the Baltimore City Police Department. So again, I'm cautiously pessimistic about the consent decree. I think the people behind it are well-intentioned. I hope to see improvement, but the kind of change that Premal's talking about, that I'm talking about, I think it's going to be hard for it to be done in the context of a consent decree sort of working pretty much solely within that organization.
Thank you. Carol, do you have another?
Yeah, well, I did want to piggyback on one of the other premises that we'd like to hear you both speak about, and that is this whole notion, we're talking about the structural nature of this by design. So I really would like to hear your thoughts on this private prison system and the profitability, and is there a way to dismantle that infrastructure, because it's a major portion of what this is. I mean, it's the new form of slavery. So what are your thoughts about the privatization of prisons, and what can we do to dismantle those kind of structures?
So I'll go first, and I'll try to be brief. Again, I can't say anything really about private prisons other than, it's an awful idea. It creates all the wrong incentives. The fact that it's going to, really, if the goal for that company is to serve its shareholders, then all the incentives are to cut services and to do the minimum for the people that are in their care. They're also sort of entering into contracts where there's an obligation to fill the beds. And so it creates this incentive on the system to generate more residents at this facility that has, that they've entered into a contract with the, with the local authorities, with the local courts. Again, our government-run prisons and jails are deeply troubled as well, but they are still, the strong preference is to have, again, Premal and I have been in more than our share of jails and prisons. There is such a thing as a good warden. There are people that are committed public servants that are trying to do the best they can for the people that are in their care. As a structural issue, I don't see how a corporate entity has the incentives to serve the needs of the community, and defining the community as the clients in there and their family, their loved ones, and the rest of the citizens that surround that facility.
And I would just, I completely agree with everything Jim said, and so I would say there's two separate, issues in the question. I think one is about privatization, which is, like I said, I agree with everything that Jim said. It should never be mixed with any sort of governmental or public, enterprise in this way. And it's scary. And the way that I see privatization playing out in the prison industrial complex now, in many ways, is there are, of course, some private prisons, as you've mentioned. There are lots of other ways that private companies are engaging in our carceral system, including through contracts around video and phone calls. So lots of places, in-person visitation is being eliminated in lieu of video visitation, and that's because companies offer video and have these contracts that require it. And so it's rooting out the ability for people to see their family members, which of course is detrimental to entire communities, because family relationships are essential to community health. And so that's an area that privatization is really sort of booming. And another area that it's really booming is in surveillance. And I think that we should, it's one of the reasons I mentioned that earlier. I think that we need to be really mindful of watching the companies that stand to profit from the expansion of apps and ankle bracelets and other sort of technologies that increase the surveillance of Black and brown bodies in our country. And so I would caution against that. When it comes to incarceration itself, most of the people that are incarcerated in our country are incarcerated in government-run facilities. And so I think it's absolutely worthwhile and important to go after private prisons. But if we're going after incarceration as the problem, that's not where it's at, right? That's not the main source of the incarceration problem in our country.
What you and Jim both just were talking about brings to mind a point that was, I think, a really salient point that was made somewhere along the line in the film, and that was that mass incarceration authorizes brutality against Black people. And in that way, I think it just becomes a self-fulfilling kind of perpetuating Sheen, I'm wondering if either or both of you could comment on how that works.
What? I got to admit, you cut out for a second there. Would you mind I just missed the quote.
Sure. Yeah, it was that mass incarceration authorizes brutality against Black people.
Well, I guess I would probably go back to this. I mean, I guess there's a bunch of ways for me to address that, but one is just, again, just the brutality of being incarcerated, of just sort of, it's the taking away of your freedom, but there's a brutality of just being in there, of the way you were humiliated, the searches, the cavity searches, you know, the taking away of your humanity by putting putting you in a cage and in a uniform, probably a degrading uniform, identifying you by a number. You can't go anywhere of your free. No one, again, sort of trying to imagine yourself, setting aside any risk from other inmates and sort of stuff you may see on TV, just imagine the degradation from being in the control of the state in that way. And heaven forbid, as sort of we talked about earlier, you do not want to be in a, you do not want to be ill. You do not want to be at risk of a health crisis. You don't want to be in a jail in a pandemic. You don't want to be dependent on correctional officers working at very low wages and modest or no healthcare workers on staff to help you through that kind of crisis. But being in jail in and of itself is a violent act against humanity.
Primal, did you want to add to that, or Carol, should we?
I'm
Go ahead,
happy to.
Primal. Yes.
Although I really would, I mean, it was very well put, and the thought I was having about what Jim's comments were about the pandemic were you know, basically exactly the same, in that the pandemic really highlighted in lots of ways the brutality, right? Because while those of us who are not incarcerated and are able to exercise free will in the world, we're social distancing and have been social distancing because that's a choice that we could make. Like, it's literally the point of incarceration not to allow you the choice to exercise autonomy over your body. And so the pandemic for me was a real point of highlighting that. I'd also just say that in addition to the stark brutality that incarceration presents, which cannot be understated, there's this other sort of more amorphous control, you know, that the criminal system exercises over people. It's not quite as physically brutal, right, as caging human beings in the way that Jim so perfectly described, but that takes control over people's lives. And you know, there's been the misdemeanor courts are a really good example of this. And there's been a lot written about this. And in particular, I'm thinking of a book by someone named Issa Kohler-Hausman called Misdemeanor Land, which, you know, describes this world called misdemeanor land, where it's the court system is not so much at all concerned with whether you did or did not commit a certain offense, but more about what your future behavior will be and whether you can perform a certain number of things that will show that you're deserving of being off of surveillance or out of the court's jurisdiction. And it's that kind of social control that undergirds the entire system, all the way through to incarceration and the most horrific punishments, but also down at those sort of really what we consider minor levels that that I think it's just the spectrum of brutality that we've, you know, allowed to fester.
Carol, another?
Yeah, we have several. I'm going to ask a light question at the moment that will be very easy to answer, and put your information in the chat room. And then I'm going to jump into perhaps two themes that will probably take us, through the end of the conversation. But we had someone ask if the two of you would share your contact information to be invited as a potential speaker at schools. So we've got a great deal of interest. We're loving what we're hearing from you. And if you could provide your contact information, we'd be happy to share it with the group so that they can connect with you separately.
I'm happy to do that, especially if Premal will come with me.
Same. Jim will come with me, yes.
Okay, so I'm taking it to the next level. I'm going to kick it up a notch, and I already know that the issue is, while we have to ask the big questions, and maybe this is aspirational, but someone did ask, would it do any good to amend the 13th Amendment by cutting the language "except punishment for crime" clause? Can we do this? How do we even begin to move the needle towards that? And as we're speaking of legislation, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about ALEC and the fact that there are lots of corporations that are feeding the legislation that's creating this system of mass incarceration, and then further profiting from it. So just if you had any thoughts from the greater legislative perspective.
Go for it, Jim. I can if you want me to, it's fine.
Go ahead, you first, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm no expert in constitutional amendments. I mean, clearly that language should not be in the amendment. I think so. I'd support any efforts to remove it. And with respect to legislative reform, I mean, I think this is a really robust area for discussion and for thinking about some of the things we've talked about already around privatization and the role that private interests can play. And I'll go back to my sort of broken record on cautioning against easy reforms, because I think so much of that is tied to companies that stand to profit from them. And so just being really careful about, what we're replacing our current system with, and thinking hard about who stands to benefit. So that's a role that I think that the film does a really beautiful job of showing the undercurrent of lobbying and private interests in the creation of a lot of the structures that we have now. Of course, those things continue, right? Like those are realities in our American political system. And I think that increased public education, increased, interest by the public in understanding some of those things and really digging into them is going to be critical, particularly as more and more states and jurisdictions are interested in changes. Right? There's an increasing national conversation, not just around policing, but around so many things, around fines and fees, and around sentencing, and all of these are important conversations. But again, we need to be really careful and thoughtful about what's driving them.
I'll weigh in real quick, but so I guess one of the things that these questions have, I guess, inspired in me to think is that, again, I think Premal and I both believe, that the system is profoundly broken and it's going to take this dramatic change to make it better. On the other hand, I too feel frustrated. When's that going to happen, and how long is that going to take, and how many conversations and questions is it going to take? It does feel to me like there's parts of this that can be knocked off and that would make the world just a little bit better. And so just mandatory minimums and things like that maybe feels like there should be able to get enough momentum to sort of stem that tide. And this privatization piece seems like it's one of those things. Again, I'm just so struck by the fact that on a weeknight, you guys have gathered so many people to get on this chat. You know, the mobilization of a group like this to say, let's protest this corporation because they're doing this work. Let's get the word out about, you know, what other companies sort of do business with these private prisons or these other organizations that are having a negative impact on our country and our community, and create boycotts or whatever it may be. It feels like that's something grassroots work. It's daunting to think about the constitutional amendment right now, but again, sort of at least from a grassroots perspective, this feels like something that we could perhaps chunk off and make the world a little bit better for some of our clients.
Carol, another?
Okay, we have a couple of Maryland-focused questions. So if you have any insights on that. One person was asking, does Maryland still use cash bail? And another question had to do with, let's see, Maryland wrongful convictions. Do you all know if there's any data on how many wrongful convictions might have taken place in Maryland, or what our statistics look like?
I probably don't know the data. Premal, do you know? I think I know the cash bail answer, but I know you've worked in that realm before. Do you want to address that, or do you want me to take a shot?
I'm certainly not. You're much more of a Maryland expert than I am. There is definitely cash bail in Maryland.
Right. So I think there's been big efforts at reform. I think progress has been made. I think that, again, the problem with the criminal justice system is, that it's like a massive ocean liner, that it is very hard to make that shift. And even as reforms have been passed and good people, have worked on them for years, Doug Colbert at the University of Maryland and others have done, remarkable work there with lots of students over the years. I think they've made legislative process. I think it's hard to change the hearts and minds of judges who are, if I can't impose a cash bond, I'm gonna detain them another way. So I think the practical impact has still been pretty modest. I do think cash bonds exist. I do know there's been excellent innocence work done in Maryland. I don't know the volume of it. Again, I'm trying to, Premal's in her way has been a mentor to me in trying to think through this, transition from the stories to the systemic solutions. And again, I think innocence cases are the product of an underfunded defense function, not good lawyering because of problems in the delivery of indigent defense services or defense services in general. And also sort of, again, kind of the overwhelming power of the prosecution. Again, our office, which I think is a well-funded office that I think we have excellent lawyers, Premal worked for us for years. We've had clients plead guilty to offenses that they didn't commit, and it eventually got uncovered years later. And it was because they saw how much was stacked on top of them as far as a potential sentence, that they sort of cut a deal. And, again, years later, in this instance, the one I have in mind, the prosecutors figured out when somebody else told on somebody else who had committed the crime, and they got a confession and DNA. And, this other individual that we had represented had stood up in open court and said he was, guilty, in fact guilty, because he thought his safest path was to take a guilty plea. So again, I think Maryland does a decent job of uncovering them, but there are systemic flaws. I think the State Defender's Office, which I worked in for years and have a lot of respect for, I think caseloads are very high, and and can present problems there. Again, I'm not taking a shot at the Maryland State Defender's Office. It's a funding issue. The people there are very good, but they have funding challenges.
Okay. I wanted to just throw one more theme out there, and I think you guys have covered greatly so many of the questions that came through. I also noticed that you both mentioned the fact how wonderfully the film brings us from the point of slavery all the way up to what's going on today, and how these infrastructures become institutionalized in our democracy. And I thought it might be good to talk a little bit about the concept of the Southern strategy, and this recurring theme of being a law and order candidate, and how important it is to recognize and understand that that is a very specific tactic and strategy to mobilize support while also instilling, perpetuating these narratives that are untrue. Are there any correlations that you can draw to what's currently going on, and what we should be aware of as we go into this next political arena coming up in a few months?
Again, I have a feeling Premal's answer is going to be much better and more thoughtful than mine, but I'll take a quick shot. And again, I'm sort of no political expert. I guess I have to temper myself sometimes, because there's a frustration and an occasional anger about the way things work. And again, I think Premal and others have pushed hard to see that that we have to politically, to bring change, we have to create bonds and build relationships. My sense is my understanding, my historic understanding of the Southern strategy was again similar to what our current president does. It was a goal to divide and to tear people apart. I probably have to resist the urge to sort of just launch and say I'm pissed at all of them, and just want to do everything I can to protect my clients. I think to bring real change, and it's one of the things that again was encouraging in the response to George Floyd's death, was it seemed to bring a lot of people together. And again, I think there's a lot of unfairness in this country that many of us, many Americans, can find common ground in trying to right that wrong. Black people, white people, Southern people, Northern people, Midwestern people, many have been shafted by our political system and by our justice system and by our economic system. And there should be common ground to bring us together, to bring about real change. But again, my historical understanding of the Southern strategy is it was about division. And we're currently, our current president prides himself in being able to do that, much to, I think, the detriment of our cause.
Premal, did you want to go ahead? Sorry.
I was just, I think that Jim put it very well. I don't think I have anything to add to that. That's great.
So we do have a question from Hans, of all people, about asking about the impact of decriminalizing drug offenses. How do we create some public momentum for that? Which I think is there. And what impact will it have?
Premal, are you comfortable going first?
Sure. Sure. I think, in some ways this goes to some of the answers that Jim just gave to the question about Southern strategy. And I say that because I think it forces us to think about, a question that we should all be asking all the time about what we criminalize and why, right? Like, what does it mean to decide something is a crime? And what does it mean, to think about how intentional that choice was and how strategic it was by, when it was made. And so, these are not random. There wasn't some sort of, code that dropped out of the sky that decided what was a crime in the United States. These were all choices that were made. and they were intentional, and they were often politically strategic. And so I, and certainly a lot of drug offenses fall into that category. So I think that there's a real real opportunity there to think about why some of these things are criminalized to begin with. And I think the film does a great job of talking about race in particular in that context. And I also think that there's growing momentum around drug decriminalization already in so many places, that I think it's a concept that's maybe easier than others for people to get their heads around, and to sort of, maybe it's an entry point to thinking about some of the harder or different issues that we've been talking about tonight. And so to the extent that that's true, I think that more and more people talking about all of these issues, the better.
A real quick observation, sort of a story. Again, it happens in my world all the time. We quote do bigger cases, these felony cases, usually drug distribution cases. It's, again, the criminal justice system seems such a clumsy instrument for the crime, for the drug crime problem. And, so again, it's not uncommon for our office to have a client who's on, in our world, we call it supervised release, it's sort of probation, and they turn up positive. And next thing you know, in court, there's a federal prosecutor, a federal defender, a judge, a probation officer, none of us with any skill in addiction or mental health treatment, trying to decide the future of this person. It's astonishing to me. I mean, brilliant people, really smart people who have no idea what they're doing. And again, sort of this goes back to, I think, Premal saying, we just have to change sort of our mindset about what our goals are. And a great deal of the violence in our community is because we've got this huge underground economy, serving the drug trade, which when they have disputes, they can't go to the police department. And so, again, somewhere in legalization of drugs is, I think, the solution to a great many of our problems. I'm not sure I have all the answers. Maybe Hans does, but I don't.
Free will. So we're getting close to the end, and I wanted to make sure we teed up this last question. There were a couple of points for me that I think kind of got to the raw nerve of what a lot of this is about. At one point, when they're talking about the three strikes law, Brian Stevenson said, "What the effect of that is that we make them their crime." And I think someone else towards the end kind of spoke to a similar sentiment when she said, that what all this is doing is changing how we understand human dignity. And I think that is, the core of this whole problem. And I guess my question would be, how do we reclaim that dignity, and can we? I mean, I'm getting to the hope thing that we had talked about earlier, and Premal, I'm hoping you can convince me.
To be hopeful, I'm not sure that I can. But I'll try. I think, as Jim mentioned earlier, I am, first of all, inspired and catalyzed by the number of people who have shown up for this conversation and who clearly care. All the questions that came in, who clearly care a great deal about addressing the problems that we've been talking about. And I know that there are many more out there. So I think that that's a great start. I think a reason that I was really excited about this conversation and have been really excited about it is because I think that the film that's been the focal point does such an amazing job of redirecting us as viewers to think about the decisions and the strategies that went into the things that we see in daily life. And so it sort of elevates us out of this sort of daily experience, whatever our individual experiences may be vis-a-vis the criminal system, whether we have any or not. But it elevates us out of that to sort of taking a bird's eye view and realizing that so much of this was intentional and strategic, and is so grounded in structural racism and in white supremacy and you know, and political decision making, and so, you know, those pieces are the pieces that are going to get us to the place where we can address human dignity. I think, like, in order to get to a community setting, a country that genuinely cares for its residents, I think we need to upend the system as we know it. And I think the only way to do that is to ask the questions about how the structures came to exist in the first place. So that's, I don't know if that's hopeful or not, but I'm committed to trying. And it seems like many of you are as well.
Thank you. Jim, is there anything you'd like to add?
I'm not sure I really want to follow that. I thought it was beautiful. I mean, one concept that we didn't talk about here tonight was that I think is essential to reform is, you know, the concept of reentry, of helping our clients transition back into the community and embracing them. That's one way that I think, you know, probably lots of folks who maybe aren't in the criminal justice world that are on, you know, this call can try to figure out a way to do it. You know, one of Premal's old offices had this lovely woman who, you know, they hired, who had a, you know, had a criminal conviction, and she's just, you know, their community just welcomed her, helped her with this difficult transition, and she's just an amazing, special woman. We are. President Trump signed the First Step Act, and I don't have much to say positive about President Trump. And it's not transformative. It's not the kind of change that we need, but we are bringing clients home, and they're going to need support. But many of them are, you know, excited about it, welcome about it, and feel like that change is happening in our community, and that this will be, that they're going to be able to rebuild their life. I too take hope. I'm not sure whether Premal totally embraced the hope idea. I think she was encouraged by how many folks were on this, you know, were on this Zoom meeting. It's pretty remarkable, and it does feel like there's an energy around our country that can bring dramatic change. I don't think there's any mystery about what causes crime. I think it's intense poverty and a loss of hope. And you know, I feel determined, probably for my individual clients, to try to help them find hope. And I hope the folks on this call try to fight for a criminal justice system that includes hope, even for those who've been convicted and entangled in the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much for that. And there's actually a question that just came in that I want to, which is very germane. You know, one of the things we talk about when we do our work is that, you know, this reconciliation is more than putting up a marker or digging up some dirt. It's about committing acts of social justice and addressing the tentacles of systemic racism that continue to rear their ugly heads. And Joan Bryant has I think an important question here, and I think this will be our last, is that, you know, if each of us could do only one thing to advance this cause, especially when it comes to reentry, I think is important. What can people do?
Jim, do you want to go?
Premal, do you mind going first if you have an idea? Yeah.
The list, I mean, the list is, you know, a very large novel, long. There's an endless list of things people could do. I would say if people are looking for a first step, to turn to their communities, to turn to the people, I can assure you that wherever you live and wherever you work, there are people who are organizing and advocating, in addition to the work that you all are already doing in this community, that there are people doing all kinds of organizing work around the criminal system. And I think the most important thing that lots of people can do is to ask them what they need. Right? So in tons of communities, there are bail funds. There are, you know, groups of formerly incarcerated folks who are the closest to both the problem and the solution, right? They know deeply what needs are. And people like that are organizing around the country in every pocket. And so my biggest piece of advice would be to turn to your own community and to find out what people who are doing the work already need.
So again, I would embrace that and probably offer, again, if we share my contact information, it's pretty easily reached because of you know, because of the office. Again, I would be happy to sort of talk to people and direct people to organizations that, you know, that might fit their interests or needs. Like I've encountered, you know, just extraordinary organizations in Baltimore. I have a client that I hesitated over whether to bring on this call that was just has been helped so much by a reentry organization that provided housing and employment and really helped him transition to, you know, to rebuilding a life after being incarcerated for a long time. It's remarkable to see what that place was able to do, and really remarkable to see what this man was able to do. So I would, again, if folks were interested in reentry, I'd be happy to direct them to some specific organizations. We'd also talked about the idea of just getting people released. And there's organizations that help. You know, it can be transformative for a person who's being held in pretrial detention to just get released. But I think there's a bunch of ways that we could suggest. And if folks want to reach out to me, or if there's some way to communicate through Will, I'd be happy to do it.
So Jim, along those lines, I think maybe what we can do is get a list of those things together, and I'll put them on our website, and I'll put them in our next newsletter. I think that would be a great thing for people to have. So we've kind of reached the end here. First I want to thank both Premal and Jim for a spectacular session. I think this was just outstanding, and I learned so much, and I know that everyone who was stuck with it has really appreciated it. And for those of your friends who missed it, we are going to post the recording at some point. I'm going to want to review this again. So thank you guys so very much. Before we sign off, I do want to mention a couple of things that we have coming up. First is our next film thing is going to be September 3rd, and there's the film, The Hate You Give. That'll be September 3rd. First Thursday. And then another thing we're really excited about is a program that we're going to do with the Baltimore County Public Library, an anti-racist book club. I think we have a little slide about that. And the first meeting of that is going to be September 15th. And you can see that the book is Say It Louder by Tiffany Cross. And I do want to thank Joan Bryan so much for spearheading that for us, and also to Paula Miller and Julie Brophy from the library. Thank you guys so much. Thank you all again for coming and for supporting us. I want to particularly thank Carol and Sue Royer and Amy Millen, Beverly Bickle, David Truskello, Rose Butler, Stephanie Kimmons, and Christine Gallagher, who really made this thing happen. And I look forward to seeing you next month, if not sooner. And thank you. Take care. Have a great evening.